January 1945. The night sky over Tokyo trembled. It was not thunder. It was not the rumble of distant artillery rolling across the Kanto plain. It was something else, something that made the air itself seem to pulse with an unnatural heartbeat. In the narrow alleyways of Asakusa, beneath the low wooden eaves of 10,000 homes, families huddled close. Mothers pressed children to their chests. Old men who had survived the great earthquake of 1923 felt a familiar dread crawling up their spines. They had lived through fire before, but not like this, never like this. Above them, at 12,000 feet, the belly of a Boeing B-29 Superfortress yawned open, and from that steel womb something fell. Not the sleek, finned bombs of earlier raids. Not the high-explosive payloads that cratered factories and left rubble in geometric patterns. These were different. Long, slender canisters tumbled through the freezing air, end over end, silent as falling leaves. Inside each one, jellied gasoline, magnesium, white phosphorus. A cocktail of chemical fire designed not to destroy buildings but to erase them, to turn wood and paper into ash, to make the city itself a furnace. The first canisters split open at 2,000 feet. A constellation of small incendiaries scattered across the winter sky, each one trailing a tail of white-hot light. From the ground they looked almost beautiful, like festival fireworks, like the Hanabi displays that once lit the Sumida River in summer. But these stars did not fade. They fell, and where they touched, the world began to burn. This was the night of March 9, 1945. Operation Meetinghouse, the single most destructive bombing raid in human history. And among those who unleashed it and those who tried desperately to stop it, there existed a terror so profound, so alien to the mythology of the warrior, that it would haunt both sides long after the flames died. For the Japanese pilots who rose into that burning sky, the night became something more than combat. It became revelation. It became the moment when the samurai myth met the furnace of industrial war and crumbled into ash. To understand the terror that gripped those pilots, one must first understand the dream they had been sold. Since childhood, they had been raised on stories of invincibility. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service was not merely a military branch, it was a priesthood. Its pilots were not simply trained, they were sanctified. They flew not for victory alone, but for the emperor, for the spirit of Yamato, for a nation that believed itself chosen by divine wind. The kamikaze of the 13th century had saved Japan from Mongol invasion. The modern airmen saw themselves as inheritors of that sacred legacy. By 1945, that dream was dying, but the men still believed. Or they tried to. Flight Warrant Officer Sakai Saburo, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces, would later recall the cognitive dissonance of those final months. "We were told we were winning," he wrote. "We were told the Americans were weak, that their pilots lacked spirit, that their machines were inferior. And yet, every day fewer of us returned. Every day the sky grew darker with their bombers." The B-29 Superfortress was a machine beyond Japanese comprehension. It cruised at altitudes where the cold could freeze a man's lungs. It carried more bombs than an entire squadron of older aircraft. Its defensive armament, 12 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, could shred a Japanese fighter before it even entered effective range. And it came in waves, not dozens, not scores, hundreds. On the night of March 9, 1945, 334 B-29s lifted off from bases in the Mariana Islands. Their target, the densely packed residential districts of eastern Tokyo. Their payload, 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs. The Japanese had known the raid was coming. Radar stations along the coast detected the formation hours before it reached the capital. Air raid sirens wailed across the city. Civilians scrambled for shelters, though many of these were little more than shallow trenches covered with planks. Fire brigades assembled their meager equipment, hand pumps, buckets, wet blankets. And at airfields scattered around Tokyo, pilots ran to their planes. They flew the Nakajima Ki-84 Height, the Kawasaki Ki-61 Heen, the venerable Mitsubishi A6M0. Machines that had once been the terror of the Pacific skies. But by 1945, they were outclassed. Many were flown by novices, boys with fewer than 50 hours of flight time, rushed through training programs that had been stripped of everything but the bare essentials. The veterans, the aces who had cut too injured to fly or grounded for lack of fuel. Aviation gasoline was so scarce that training flights had become rare luxuries. Some pilots went into combat having never practiced night interception, having never fired their guns at a moving target. Still, they climbed, because that was what they had been taught, because honor demanded it, because the alternative, to sit on the ground and watch the city burn, was unthinkable. Lieutenant Nakamura Hideki was 23 years old. He had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Air Academy in 1943, a time when the war still seemed winnable, when American advances in the Pacific were dismissed as temporary setbacks. He had flown patrol missions over the home islands, intercepted a handful of reconnaissance planes, engaged in dogfights with Grumman Hellcats that left his hands shaking and his heart pounding. He was not an ace. He had 3 confirmed kills, but he was alive, and in the spring of 1945 that made him a veteran. On the night of March 9, Nakamura's squadron was scrambled just after midnight. The initial wave of B-29s had already passed over the city when his Ki-84 left the runway at Chafu Airfield, 10 miles west of central Tokyo. He climbed into a sky that no longer looked like sky. The entire eastern horizon glowed orange. Not the soft amber of sunset, but a violent, pulsating red-orange, as if the earth itself had split open to reveal some subterranean inferno. The glow cast shadows upward, turning clouds into islands of reflected fire. And the smell, even at 5,000 feet, even with the cockpit closed, he could smell it. Burning wood, burning flesh, burning city. His mission was simple: find the bombers and destroy them. But as he approached the firestorm, Nakamura realized that nothing about this night would be simple. The heat rising from the inferno created turbulence unlike anything he had experienced. His plane bucked and shuddered. Updrafts seized the wings and threw him 1,000 feet higher in seconds. Downdrafts slammed him back toward the flames. The instruments spun uselessly. Altitude, airspeed, heading, all became unreliable in the thermal chaos. Other pilots radioed in confusion. Some reported their planes catching fire from the heat alone, without ever being hit. One voice, young and cracking with panic, screamed that his controls were melting. And then Nakamura saw them. The B-29s. They flew in loose formation at less than 8,000 feet, dangerously low by their usual standards, but necessary for accuracy with the incendiaries. Their silver fuselages reflected the firelight, turning them into glowing phantoms. They seemed to move slowly, almost lazily, as if unconcerned by the hell they were creating below. As if invulnerable. Nakamura angled toward the nearest bomber, his Ki-84 engine screaming. He had practiced this 100 times, approach from below and behind. Aim for the wings where the fuel tanks were housed. A short, concentrated burst from the 20 cannons, then break away before the defensive guns could track him. Clean, efficient, deadly. But as he closed to within 1,000 yards, the B-29's rear turret swiveled. 50 caliber barrels tracked his approach. Nakamura jinked left, then right, trying to spoil the gunner's aim. Too late. Tracers lanced through the darkness, streams of glowing bullets that seemed to move in slow motion, then accelerated impossibly fast. One round punched through his left wing. Another shattered his canopy, filling the cockpit with freezing wind and glass fragments. He fired back, a desperate burst, saw his shells arc toward the bomber and nothing. No explosion, no fire. The B-29 flew on, untouched, as if his attack had been nothing more than an insect bite. He tried again. Another approach. Another burst. This time he saw sparks dance along the bomber's fuselage. A hit. But still it did not fall. It did not even waver. The defensive fire intensified. Two more turrets joined the first. The sky around Nakamura became a web of tracers, a cage of light and metal. He pulled up hard, felt the G-forces crush him into his seat, felt his vision tunnel to a gray pinprick. When he leveled out, the B-29 was gone, lost in the smoke and fire below. He was not alone in his failure. All across the burning sky, Japanese fighters dove and climbed and fired and died. Some managed to down a bomber, a lucky shot to the engine, a kamikaze ram that took both planes into the inferno. But for every B-29 that fell, a dozen more continued their runs, dropping their payloads with methodical precision. The American pilots had been briefed on the target. The Shitamachi district, where wooden buildings stood wall to wall, where narrow streets funneled wind into natural blast channels. The bombers laid their incendiaries in a giant X pattern, turning shelters into ovens. People who fled into the canals to escape the flames boiled alive. People who stayed in their homes were cremated where they stood. From the air, Nakamura watched the X take shape. He watched the fires merge into a single, unified conflagration. He watched neighborhoods vanish beneath a blanket of smoke and ember-lit haze. And he understood, with a clarity that cut through exhaustion and fear, that he was witnessing the end of something. Not just the destruction of a city, but the annihilation of an idea. The idea that spirit could overcome material. That courage could defeat industry. That Japan, through will alone, could turn back the tide of American abundance. Because that was what the B-29s represented. Not merely technological superiority, but abundance. Each bomber was a marvel of engineering, pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, radar navigation. Each one cost $600,000 to build, the equivalent of dozens of Japanese fighters, and America built them by the thousand. The Mariana Islands, from which the Tokyo raids were launched, had been captured only months before. Already they housed 6 airfields capable of handling hundreds of heavy bombers. The logistics were staggering. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every spare part had to be shipped across 5,000 miles of ocean. And yet the raids came every night. Relentless, unstoppable. Japanese pilots had been told that Americans were soft, that they lacked the stomach for prolonged war, that their democracy made them weak, divided, incapable of the sacrifices necessary for victory. But here, in the burning sky over Tokyo, that narrative collapsed. The Americans did not need individual heroism. They had systems. They had factories that could outproduce the entire Japanese war machine 10 times over. They had a strategic bombing doctrine that reduced cities to statistical targets, calculating acceptable losses in tons of ordnance per square mile. They had, in short, industrialized death. And they had something else. Something that terrified Nakamura more than the bombs themselves. They had chosen to do this. The firebombing of Tokyo was not an accident of war. It was not collateral damage. It was deliberate, planned, executed with cold precision. The American commander, General Curtis LeMay, had stripped the B value but for its vulnerability. 16 square miles of densely packed wooden homes, 100,000 civilians dead in a single night, 1 million more left homeless. The numbers were incomprehensible. The intent was clear. This was not war as Nakamura had been taught to understand it. This was annihilation. Flight Warrant Officer Takahashi Kenji encountered the firestorm from a different angle. His squadron had been stationed at Atsugi, south of the city. By the time he reached Tokyo, the raid was in full fury. He climbed to 15,000 feet, hoping to engage the bombers before they entered their attack runs. But the smoke had risen like a thunderhead, a churning column of gray and black that towered into the stratosphere. He could not see through it, could not see below it. His wingman's voice crackled over the radio. "It's like flying into a volcano." Takahashi circled the edge of the smoke, searching for targets. And then through a gap in the cloud he saw them. Not the bombers, the people. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, streaming through the streets like rivers of ants. They carried children, bundles of belongings, anything they could salvage. They ran toward the Sumida River, toward the canals, toward any open space that might offer refuge. From 5 miles up, they looked like grains of rice scattered across a burning griddle. He watched one group, maybe 100 people, reach the river's edge. They hesitated at the water as if weighing the risk. Behind them, a wall of fire advanced, a wave of orange light that consumed everything in its path. The people jumped. Takahashi saw them disappear into the black water. He circled back minutes later. The river was choked with bodies, floating face down, packed so tightly that they formed a human dam. Takahashi did not sleep for 3 days after that night. When he finally did, he dreamed of falling. Not in a plane, just falling through smoke and fire into water that turned. The terror was not limited to what the pilots saw below. It extended to what they could not do. Nakamura and Takahashi and 100 others flew sortie after sortie, burning through their dwindling fuel reserves, firing until their ammunition was exhausted. And it made no difference. The bombers kept coming. On the night of March 9, Japanese fighters managed to down 14 B-29s, 14 out of 334, a loss rate of 4%. Acceptable according to American planners. The raids would continue, and they did. March 11, Nagoya. March 13, Osaka. March 16, Kobe. April 13, Tokyo again. Every city with a population over 100,000 became a target. Every raid followed the same pattern. Low-altitude incendiary attacks, timed to coincide with high winds, aimed at residential districts where war workers lived. The official justification was that Japan's war production was decentralized, that cottage industries in civilian neighborhoods produced components for military equipment. The practical effect was the deliberate targeting of non-combatants on a scale that dwarfed the early Blitz of London. For the Japanese pilots, each raid became a repetition of the same nightmare. They would scramble, climb into the inferno, fire uselessly at the silver giants above, and return, if they returned, to airfields surrounded by ash. Their ground crews, their mechanics, their friends, lived in the cities that burned. Some pilots landed to find their bases half destroyed, their barracks flattened, their commanding officers dead. Others learned that their families had been incinerated in the previous night's raid. And still, they flew, because there was nothing else to do, because surrender was unthinkable, because the emperor had not yet spoken, but the terror was changing them, not all at once, not in a single dramatic break, but slowly, raid by raid, death by death, they began to understand that they were not warriors in any traditional sense. They were witnesses. Witnesses to the end of their nation, their culture, their world. The samurai code spoke of dying with honor, of choosing death over dishonor. But how could one die with honor when death was industrialized? Some sought the only honorable death left to them: kamikaze. By the spring of 1945, suicide attacks had become Japan's primary naval and air tactic. Young pilots, some with fewer than 20 hours of flight time, were given just enough fuel to reach an American ship and told to crash into it. The ritual around these missions was elaborate, ceremonial sake, headbands inscribed with rising suns, final letters to family. The pilots who volunteered were celebrated as heroes, as the truest embodiment of Bushido. But those who knew them saw the truth in their eyes. Many were terrified. Many wept before takeoff. And many, when they climbed into those overloaded, underarmed planes, knew that their deaths would change nothing. That they were not heroes, but fuel for a machine that had long since lost any rational objective. Lieutenant Nakamura never flew a kamikaze mission. He survived the war, though his squadron did not. Of the 24 pilots with whom he had trained, Only 3 lived to see September 1945. In the decades after, he rarely spoke of the firebombing, but in a recorded interview in 1987, he said something that captured the essence of that terror. "We were not afraid of death," he said. "We were afraid of meaninglessness. We were afraid that everything we had been taught, everything we believed, was a lie. And on the night the fire fell, we knew it was." The firebombs themselves became objects of a strange, perverse fascination. The M69 incendiary cluster bomb was a masterpiece of destructive engineering. Each cluster contained 47 submunitions, each weighing 6 pounds. When the cluster split open at 2,000 feet, the submunitions scattered across a wide area. Each one was designed to penetrate a roof, ignite inside the structure, and spray jellied gasoline in a radius of several feet. The fire started small, a glowing pool on a tatami mat, a smoldering beam. But they spread with terrifying speed. Wooden buildings, paper walls, bamboo rafters, the traditional architecture of Japan was kindling. Within minutes, a single hit could engulf an entire block. Within an hour, entire neighborhoods became firestorms. The firestorm phenomenon was not new. It had occurred in Hamburg in 1943, in Dresden in February 1945. But Tokyo's firestorm was the largest ever recorded. The rising column of superheated air created winds of over 100 miles per hour at ground level. These winds fed the flames, turning the fire into a self-sustaining reaction that consumed oxygen faster than it could be replaced. In shelters suffocated as the fire sucked the air from underground spaces. The temperature at the heart of the firestorm reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass, to vaporize metal, to reduce human bone to ash. For the pilots above, the firebombs became a symbol of everything they were powerless to stop. They could see the clusters fall, could watch the submunitions scatter like seeds, could trace the pattern of fires that bloomed across the city. But they could not intercept them. The clusters fell too fast, too unpredictably. Even if a fighter pilot managed to shoot down a B-29 before it dropped its payload, there were a dozen more behind it. The bombs fell, and the city burned, and the pilots flew through the smoke and heat in terror, knowing that their presence changed nothing. There were moments of surreal beauty amid the horror. Takahashi recalled seeing, through a gap in the smoke, a single cherry tree in full bloom, untouched by the flames. It stood in the courtyard of a temple, surrounded by burning buildings, its white petals glowing in the firelight. He circled it twice, transfixed, before the smoke closed in again. When he returned to the area days later, the temple was gone. The tree was gone. Nothing remained but a field of ash. Another pilot, whose name was lost to history, described a moment when he flew through the smoke column and emerged above it. The sky at that altitude was clear, cloudless, filled with stars. He could see the curvature of the earth, the dark ocean beyond the coast. For a moment he felt a profound peace, and then he looked down and saw the red glow beneath the smoke, and the peace shattered. These moments of beauty made the terror worse. They reminded the pilots that the world still existed, that there were places untouched by war, that life continued somewhere beyond the fire. But for them, for Tokyo, for Japan, there was no escape. The fire had become their reality, the smoke their sky, the B-29s their gods, capricious, unstoppable, indifferent. The epilogue of Operation Meetinghouse was written in ash and bone. When the fires finally died, 3 days after the raid, the toll became clear. 16 square miles of Tokyo were gone, not damaged, gone. Over 250,000 buildings destroyed. 100,000 people dead, more than would die in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Another million left homeless, wandering through a landscape so thoroughly annihilated that survivors could not recognize streets they had walked their entire lives. The heat had been so intense that bodies were reduced to shadows, outlines of carbon burned into stone. The Japanese government suppressed the true numbers for decades. Officially, the dead numbered 83,000. Unofficially, historians now estimate between 100,000 and 200,000 fatalities. Many bodies were never recovered, never identified. Entire families vanished without trace. The Sumida River carried corpses to the sea for weeks. For the pilots who survived, the terror did not end with the war. Many suffered what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares of burning cities, of people running through fire, of planes that would not fall no matter how many times they were hit. Some turned to alcohol, some to silence, refusing to speak of the war for the rest of their lives. And some, like Nakamura, tried to make sense of what they had witnessed, tried to reconcile the mythology of the warrior with the reality of industrial slaughter. In his final interview, recorded shortly before his death in 1999, Nakamura was asked if he hated the Americans. He paused for a long time before answering. "I hated them that night," he said. "I hated them for what they were doing, for the power they had, for the choice they made. But later I understood. They were not monsters, they were just abundant. They had so much, so many planes, so many bombs, so many resources, that they could afford to burn a city to save soldiers. To them, it was a calculation. To us, it was the end of the world. And the terrible truth is, their calculation was correct. The fire broke us, not our bodies, our spirits. We kept fighting for months after, but we knew. We had lost the moment the first firebomb fell." The symbolism of the firebomb, on the belief that spirit could overcome material, that a warrior's will was stronger than a factory's output. The firebombs proved otherwise. They demonstrated with brutal clarity that modern war was not a contest of courage, but of production. That the nation which could build more planes, drop more bombs, burn more cities would win. Not because it was braver or more honorable or divinely favored, but because it had more. The pilots who flew into the fire understood this in a way that the generals and politicians did not. They saw, from their cockpits, the true face of American power, not the democracy or freedom that would be celebrated after the war, but the raw, terrifying capacity to destroy. And they understood that this capacity was not born of cruelty, but of abundance. The same industrial might that produced cars and refrigerators and washing machines could produce B-29s and firebombs. The same logistical networks that delivered consumer goods to every corner of America could deliver death to every corner of Japan. The same pragmatic, utilitarian mindset that built highways and dams could calculate that burning 100,000 civilians was an acceptable cost to shorten the war. This was the revelation that terrified the pilots more than the fire itself. Not that they were losing. They had known that for months, perhaps years, but that they had never had a chance. That the mythology they had been raised on, the invincibility of the warrior spirit, the divine protection of the homeland, was not just false, but irrelevant. In a war of factories and firebombs, samurai swords and Bushido codes meant nothing. 70 years after the firebombing, Tokyo rebuilt itself into one of the world's great cities. The ashes were cleared. The dead were mourned and buried. New buildings rose from the ruins, taller and stronger than those that had burned. But the memory of the fire lingered, in the testimonies of survivors, in the silence of the pilots who flew that night, in the knowledge, passed down through generations, that the city had once been consumed and had somehow endured. The terror of the firebombing was not the terror of combat. It was the terror of help. Sacrifice meant nothing in the face of industrial might. It was the terror of obsolescence, the knowledge that the warrior, as an archetype, as an ideal, had been rendered meaningless by the logic of modern war. And perhaps in the end that was the most profound legacy of the fire. Not the destruction it wrought, but the illusion it destroyed. The illusion that war was glorious, that death in battle was noble, that spirit alone could turn the tide of history. The pilots who flew into the burning sky over Tokyo learned what soldiers throughout the 20th century would learn. That modern war is not an arena for heroes, but a machine for producing corpses. That the side with more machines wins, and that the fire once lit consumes everything, buildings, bodies, beliefs, leaving only ash and the terrible clarity that comes after. The night sky still trembles sometimes on quiet March evenings in Tokyo. Not with bombers, not with fire, but with memory, with the knowledge that 70 years ago the